Stand and Deliver. Written and read by Adam Ant. Adam Ant was born in 1976 in the grey, cold, echoing emergency ward of Free and Barnet Hospital, North London. He was smacked into consciousness by a hard-faced and overworked charge nurse who calmly said, "Wake up, you little bastard." I groaned. Satisfied that I was awake, she left me alone. Somewhere down a winding, peeling corridor, a woman was screaming. As I sat up, groggy and feeling lost, I saw the name Stuart Goddard written in chalk on a board next to a door marked ECG. But I had killed Stuart Goddard. A handful of my mother-in-law's pills taken from the yellow cabinet in her bathroom had done the job. A few hours earlier, as Stuart, I sat, white and trembling, in the little room that I shared with my wife Carol on the ground floor of her parents' house in Muswell Hill. Adam was preparing for his big entrance. Not that anyone noticed anything unusual. Carol was cutting some cloth on the swirl-patterned orange carpet. Somewhere there was an argument going on between my brother-in-law and his dad. The tension in that house was suffocating me. It was all too much like it had been when I was a kid. I'd been living with my stomach in a knot for I don't know how many weeks. I felt disorientated and seemed to be falling, even when I was lying down. I looked at the pills for a while, not really thinking anything. Then I snatched the bottle, took a handful, swilling them down with tap water. After a while, it was hard to tell how long, sitting on the bed watching Carol, time seemed to stop. Her movements were all in slow motion. I heard myself speak as if it was someone else. "Carol, I've taken a load of your mum's pills." She looked scared. "I can't do this anymore. I can't be Stuart Goddard. I can't be married. I can't play bass in bands. I can't finish college." I might have said all of that, but it might just have easily stayed trapped in my head because at some point I blacked out. The next thing I know, I'm Adam, and they want to put a few thousand volts through my head in Free and Barnet Hospital. Fuck that, I thought. I'm off. The funny thing is, no one tried to stop me. At the reception desk, I just said I'm leaving. I climbed into my father-in-law's car and settled back in the seat next to my wife. "Why did you do it, Stuart?" Carol asked me. "Call me Adam," I replied. "Why Adam?" "Because." "Has she had it yet?" "Yes, Mr. Goddard, at 6:20 this morning. Before the nurse could finish, my father, Les, had dropped the receiver, raised a clenched fist, and raced to the nearest pub to celebrate with his mates. Only after much toasting and backslapping did it dawn on him that he hadn't asked if it was male or female. The news that he had a son prompted an even more joyous return to the bar, where Les continued drinking with a renewed vigour. Why shouldn't he? After all, it was what Les did. His first and only son had been born at Middlesex Hospital, Mortimer Street, London, on the 3rd of November 1954. My mother remembers it as being a difficult birth, her memory not made any sweeter by the fact that after several hours of agony she passed out exhausted, without the first sight of her firstborn. That honour was my father's, who eventually stumbled into the maternity ward in order to hold me in his arms. It was just one other thing that Mum never forgave him for. They named me Stuart Leslie, Stuart after my Scottish Uncle Mac, who was a sergeant in the legendary Black Watch Regiment. My parents had met in 1947. Mum, or Betty Kathleen Smith, was just 15 years old. A sultry, dark-haired beauty, she worked as an embroideress for Norman Hartnell, the Queen's dressmaker. Dad, Leslie Alfred Goddard, was 20 and an ex-RAF corporal just back from national service in Iraq, Iran and Palestine. Now earning a living as a driver for the News Chronicle, he was apparently something of a snappy dresser, and it was his job to get Chronicle reporters to the scene of the big story first. Very Raymond Chandler, he liked to think it was, screeching around corners in big black Buicks. That first day they met, he was waiting by his car when Mum, on her lunch break, walked past him and he let out a low whistle. She stopped, called him cheeky, and they got to talking. 4 blissfully happy years after their first date, Les and Betty went and spoiled it all by getting married. on St Patrick's Day. After a brief and predictably romantic stay at a room above a shop in St John's Wood High Street, they moved to the De Walden Buildings in Allison Road, NW8. A big brown brick Victorian slum, there was no electricity or gas, no toilet or running water. The only water supply came from a stone sink on the landing, shared with 8 other families. However, by far the biggest worry was the community crapper, a black hole with a stench guaranteed to give you instant constipation, and until I was almost 12, we would have to use buckets of water to flush it out every morning. Our flat, number 4, was, to say the least, cosy, consisting of a kitchen-cum-living room area and a bedroom only. That was it. There was no more. The kitchen had a single window, framed by red-striped 1950s curtains with a floral motif. The kitchen table was the focal point of the room, because there we ate and drank. And leaned. We leaned on the table to watch the almighty television that stood in the corner by the bedroom door. It would become very important to me, that television. At times it would seem as if it was the light of my life. The thick, lingering smoke of my father's roll-ups was always present throughout our flat. My mum tells me that she would often find a blissfully happy baby Stuart staring at the blank television screen and sucking his way through an ashtray of cigarette butts. I was a far from gorgeous child. My mum later told me, people would come over to have a peek at you and say, "Oh, what a lovely pram." When I was barely out of nappies, my mum took a job in a small restaurant called the Black Tulip, situated in the High Street, St John's Wood. The place did a good business, serving a variety of dishes centred mainly on bacon, egg and chips. She wore a black dress with a white frilly collar and cuffs, just like the other waitresses, Joan Pocket and Kathleen Hanzavniak. These 2 women soon became my surrogate aunties. Auntie Joan sported not only the biggest, reddest head of intricately rolled hair I'd ever seen, but wore makeup thicker than a kabuki actor. Her face was literally painted on. This both delighted and fascinated me. I'm convinced that this is one of the reasons why I was attracted to makeup in my later life. Auntie Kathleen, on the other hand, was a Betty Davis type. While Mum waitressed, I was looked after by Nanny Smith, just around the corner in Cochrane Street. In her late 60s, Nan looked much older, with a thin, kindly face and body so delicate you wondered how she had borne 6 children. Her husband and my maternal grandfather, Walter Albany Smith, became my first hero when I discovered that he was the reason that my father Les wore dentures where his 4 front teeth should have been. Grandad Smith had dragged Les out of a pub and knocked the teeth, and him, out with a single punch one day after he found out that he'd hit my mum. Wally was definitely a person to be respected. My father's father, Grandad Tom Goddard, was an unlikely combination of musician, taxi driver, drinker and heavy gambler. He was a fine musician and led his own band, legend having it that he could play any instrument he tried. At his top floor flat in Paddington, Grandad's upright piano stood against the front room parlour wall. On Sunday afternoons as a child, I'd sit up there mercilessly banging away at the keys. A record entitled Sparky's Magic Piano had convinced me that it was only a matter of time before my chimp-like compositions would suddenly transform into a classical masterpiece. Funnily enough, that never happened. Grandad Tom was memorable for his nose more than anything else. I can remember when it first came at me in my pram through blinding white sunlight. Potato-shaped it was, with red veins mapping out curvy roads around the bulbous, fleshy mainland to the hidden caverns of his nostrils. Every part of it seemed to throb, and I wondered if he was in pain of any kind. But no, for here was a prime example of the true Cockney boozer's conk. Otherwise, Grandad was a bit of a dandy. He always wore a pinstripe suit with a starched white shirt, regimental tie and a fresh carnation. Unfortunately, he held a pathological dislike of my father. Through no fault of his own, Les was to suffer for the death of his elder brother Charlie, who, by all accounts, was something of a prodigy. He was well behaved, intelligent and loving. Perfect. When he died of pneumonia at the age of 5, Les didn't stand a chance. To my heartbroken Grandad, Les was a constant reminder of his great loss. All Les's efforts at school were dismissed as never being up to scratch, while any display of love from my grandmother toward her son was punishable by Tom. My father's mother, my grandmother Caroline, was usually referred to by her nickname, Bill. Her family had moved from Romney to the delightful village of Cookham in Berkshire just before World War I. Billy went into service as an under-parlour maid at the age of 14. She progressed through the ranks to a position of cook for a Prussian Archduke, no less. Then she met and married Tom and carried on doing the same thing, but without a wage. Gran's Sunday roasts are memorable to this day. Perfect sides of roast lamb, beef and pork, dressed with lashings of vegetables, and with the help of a gin or two, she could be encouraged to sing a song, which were no charming little folk songs, but old vaudeville tunes. The fiddle is my sweetheart. I play and play all day, but when the strings are broken, throw the bleeding thing away. Because both my parents worked and there wasn't always someone around to leave me with, I sometimes spent hours alone creating an imaginary world. I'd imagine the bed was a huge steamship, for instance, and stand on the bow, my father's chauffeur cap on back to front. I was a sailor and the floor surrounding me a turbulent sea, filled with the most dangerous of sharks and exotic fish. A one-eyed teddy bear named Chessie would accompany me on the Amazonian adventures through the infamous Bedstead Pass to the plains of the Kitchen Table or Sideboard Mountain. My nights were spent sleeping first in my parents' bed and then later on a folding Z bed in the kitchen to which I'd be carried after Dad got home, and Dad never got home before the pubs closed. I'll never forget the sound of his footsteps crossing the yard below, that low, boozy cough as he approached the stairs. These sounds would wake me up like a terrible alarm clock. Then I'd have to pretend that I was asleep, because I knew what followed would be awful, and I wanted no part of it. His key twisted in the lock, and in would come that night's Mr. Hyde. The mighty arguments soon followed the first icy moments of silent hatred. Mum was in a no-win situation. If she didn't start up the proceedings with a, "So what time d'you call this?" he'd pick on her with, "What are you looking at?" Then he'd attack her with a stream of vile language, making unjustified accusations for anything he considered her guilty of. Slow, ugly words spat out of his purple, puffy, twisted face. It wasn't an experimental concoction that transformed this Dr. Les Jekyll, the kindest of men, into the nightly beast, though, but a dozen or so pints of Whitbread light ale. Angel to arsewipe, every night, like some sick magic. The magic was at its sickest when I'd hear my mum's screams suddenly turn into a low moan. Then I knew he'd hit her, in the stomach or in the face. It was only this that stopped my pretending to be asleep, and I'd run to her where she'd fallen, crumpled in the corner. I'd press my face to hers, a face still wet with tears and streaked by comical streams of running makeup. As the child of an alcoholic, I find it easy to be a teetotaler. I'm not brave enough to believe that I might not have inherited this gene. All the nightly nonsense eventually affected me. I started to sleepwalk and hallucinate. The sleepwalking, so I am told, usually took the form of me desperately trying to open the front door and get away. The hallucinations were terrifying. Sitting, wide awake in the early hours of the morning, I'd be in the middle of a giant aquarium. Perfect three-dimensional Technicolor fish would swim all around the room. Sharks, stingrays and Portuguese men of war would slide past within inches of my pyjamas. I would shake my parents awake to ask them what was going on, pointing at the different creatures as they passed. This usually scared them enough for Les to promise that he would mend his ways, which indeed he would, for about 2 days. Just below the television, and almost as holy in my childhood home, sat the red Dansette record player. Music often filled the air at number 40 Walden, providing comfort, excitement and escape, at least when Les wasn't around. I shut my eyes and think back to those times and feel a warm glow inside, especially when I remember Ricky, the babysitter. A blonde beatnik, she played down her considerable looks by wearing slacks, huge sloppy Joe pullovers, and wild glasses which swept out to each side of her face like the wings of a Cadillac. I grew very fond of Ricky. She brought a sense of joy whenever she came to see me. But above all, she brought her record collection, and with it my introduction to the wonderful world of rock and roll. Elvis, Gene Vincent, Sam Cooke, all down and dirty and American, the land where everything was bigger and better. Ricky, obviously inspired by the skiffle craze, bought me a plastic Woolworths guitar when I was 4 or so. She would stand me on our table in front of the polished side of the TV. Here, in the mirrored wood, I was encouraged to mime and sing along with the music blaring from the dansette. The bright light thrown from a table lamp above created a truly stage-like setting as I strummed away at the imaginary strings. Mum had removed them right after I'd unwrapped it. My first school was Robbinsfield Infants. Mum took me the first day with surprising ease. There were no tears, no screaming. My time there was happy enough, from my point of view, although it was less enjoyable for my teachers. On 2 different days at Robbinsfield, I smashed the headmistress's office window with a brick. The first time I did it, I was showing off in front of another boy. I was given the benefit of the doubt as to whether I meant it. However, when I threw a brick through the window the second time, mainly to hear the fantastic sound of breaking glass, but also because I had liked being the centre of attention the first time, Mrs. Phillips, the headmistress, summoned Mum to the school. She informed her that I was by far the most horrible child it had ever been her misfortune to meet. My smashing time apart, Robbinsfield was the first place I became aware of girls, and the first major crush I had was for Mrs. Joanna Salomon, my form mistress. A tall redhead with long shapely legs, the time I spent gaping at her represented an almost religious experience for me. Of course, this went unnoticed by her, but importantly she returned my love by the encouragement she showed me in my schoolwork. One day she noticed my enthusiasm during the painting of a picture I called Mother Goose, which featured a large duck-shaped creature in profile, surrounded by a bright blue sky, white fluffy clouds, and feathers of many colours, all individually painted with nifty wave-like strokes of my brush. Mrs. Salomon congratulated me and called the rest of the class over to have a look. I was elated by the belief that I'd painted my way into her heart. I imagined that regardless of my size and age, we'd simply fly off somewhere together soon. She would cuddle and kiss me and let me kiss her back. I tried not to think of the inevitable day when it would all end and I'd have to go to big school, Barrow Hill. With a name more fitting for a Saxon burial mound than an inner London junior school, Barrow Hill, a red brick Victorian castle-style affair, was big, proud and unfriendly. It had an enormous playground with a cricket net at the far end where I first experienced a sense of achievement and the desire to accept responsibility. That I did was mostly due to Mr. Perkins, the sportsmaster. He was to become the first male authority figure that I admired enough to want to impress, as he moulded my primitive schoolyard efforts into a controlled style, effective enough to eventually earn me the captaincy of the school cricket 11. Mr. Perkins was a large, overpowering man who wore a lot of tweedy colours, a checked waistcoat and suede shoes. He always appeared to be slightly ruffled, as if he'd just snapped to attention after a few minutes of illicit kip in the staff room. God help you if you happen to be stupid enough to upset him. The boom of his voice could paralyse every nerve in your body. No one ever answered Mr. Perkins back. When I was 7, my parents separated. Les had given my mother her last beating. She went to the courts and got him kicked out of the flat. There wasn't a day when big men came and took him away or anything. He just didn't come home anymore. Mum must have told me, and I didn't believe it at first. But then, as my hallucinations stopped, and I realised that he really wasn't coming home anymore, I felt happy that it was just Mum and me in the 2 rooms. Although Mum was left with all the responsibility of bringing me up, she welcomed the peaceful life she now had in return. Through education, she firmly believed I could rise out of the squalor we lived in. Right up until the first hit record I had with Adam and the Ants, Mum was offering me £100 if I returned to art school to get the BA degree I'd lost by bailing out of the course to form the group. Bless her. By the time that I reached my final years at Barrow Hill, 1963 to 64, the Beatles had arrived. An era of tennis racket impersonators had begun. So convinced was I that the ability to play, or even pretend to play an instrument, was the key to a perfect social life, that I headed straight for the school music teacher, demanding to be taught how to play an instrument. The music teacher handed me a shiny new viola. Fair enough, I thought, well impressed with the beautiful varnished wood finish. Alas, after a month of trying, the noise I produced sounded like a tomcat being castrated with a pair of blunt scissors. Patient as the mistress had tried to be, she was only human, and one afternoon grabbed the viola from beneath my chin and announced that the class was ending early. I never saw the viola again, and passed up the chance of playing the triangle in the school orchestra. One fine spring afternoon on the way back from school in 1964, I quite suddenly became aware of the most irritable itching sensation on my lower back. I hitched up my shirt and had a bloody good scratch. Then I noticed the rash, a large colony of scarlet, angry-looking spots. Back at home, Mum took one look and whisked me straight up to Dr. Gilbert. Shingles, a severe case, contagious as hell, he told Mum. It seems that shingles is a nervous disease. I could see the guilt in Mum's eyes as the doctor asked if I'd been under any strain. We both denied it vehemently. All this had come at a very inopportune moment, as my mother was about to go into hospital for a hysterectomy and would be there for 3 weeks or so. There was no one else who could look after me, and so the local council took over, assigning me first to a state orphanage hospital and then to a proper foster home, where I would stay until I was fully recovered. I was taken to a large orphanage outside of Slough, where each day one of the nurses would spray me with a translucent plastic skin to prevent me from scratching my spots, and thus curb their spreading any further. After 3 days this skin had to be removed. The pain was overwhelming, as dead tissue and muck from the sores came away with the plastic as it was ripped off. I was told that if my rash joined around my middle, I could die, and that was why they had to spray me. This was the first time I slept in a room by myself though, and I found the privacy very soothing. I especially welcomed the cup of hot cocoa they gave me before I went to bed, and the little kiss the nurse would give me while tucking me in. There in the dark I clung on to that kiss, cocooned in its warm glow. It wasn't so bad this being ill, Lark, after all. When I got over my shingles, I was sent to a foster home just outside Maidenhead. It was a faceless suburban 2 up, 2 down, with a sizable garden at the back. The names and faces of my foster parents entirely escape me, but their attitude and manner doesn't. Experienced, cold and professional, they had a child of their own and 3 of us foster kids to look after. They kept us foster kids out of the no-go areas in their house, which only left us with the lavatory, our beds, and the garden to roam freely about in. But just as I was becoming miserable in Maidenhead, my miscreant father was granted permission to take me away with him for long weekends. By an enormous stroke of luck, he was living with my great-aunt Mary and Uncle Charlie in nearby Cookham. How I'd welcome the sight of Dad driving up to the foster home in his cherry-red Ford Anglia on a Saturday morning. Then we'd travel across the beautiful open Berkshire fields to a heaven on earth. Les, for all his faults, had come through for me when I really needed it. Back at De Walden Buildings, when both of us had recovered, Mum and I made the best of things. My folding Z-bed was now a permanent fixture at the foot of her bed. On the wall above my headboard, I pinned 2 team shots of Chelsea and Manchester United that I'd sent off to the Typhoo Tea Company for. Next to these, I drew 365 neat vertical lines on the wallpaper, one of which I would cross out each night with an equally neat diagonal line. This would be the closing part of my nightly ritual, during which I'd kneel by my bed and whisper a prayer, God bless his flock, Amen, with the occasional PS, and please let me grow a bit taller. Every Sunday from then, though, I would be picked up by my dad to spend the day with him. Come rain or shine, at 11 a.m. I would be out in the street waiting. And wait I did. All I did was wait. Never before 11:45 and often as late as 2 p.m. would he roll up. Then it was straight off for a beer. A large proportion of my Sunday was spent waiting outside pubs, sipping at countless glasses of warm Coca-Cola and munching away at bags of crisps with little blue bags of salt inside. Never once did he come out before that one drink too many, and never before they threw him out. Then it was off to Gran's house, where the dinner would be ruined and another dreadful argument would ensue. Nothing had changed, just the time, place and target of Les's filthy mouth. Again I'd try and shut it all out. Although slightly toned down, this was after all his mother, and never ending in physical violence, the effect on me was still the same, and I'd tremble and retreat into my own imaginary world. Eventually, though, we would sit down to eat. Les would eat only the meat and then stumble onto the couch and fall asleep. From that moment onwards, my Sundays took a turn for the better. Gran and I would sit watching the Sunday film. There was always a book I could look at, or some old photo annuals lying around, and all the while Les would snore like a bastard. Mum always referred to our flat as the Walden Prison, but there was something about the place that I liked. If I looked out of the window by my bed, up onto the top balcony opposite, I could see the front door of my first true love, Sonia Palmer. Although I must have known her for most of my short life, we had hardly ever exchanged a word. Her mother forbade Sonia, or Francois, her younger brother, to play down in the yard with us other kids. Despite my age, I had noticed how beautiful Sonia had become. No longer a scrawny, shy little kid, she suddenly had a radiant, almost teenage aura. Now, at that time, Francois was always peeking over the top balcony. He'd smile a great big gummy smile at me, and invariably Sonia would appear from behind and remove him. On one of these occasions our eyes first met. A moment passed and then she gave me a little wave. I didn't sleep a wink that night. I just lay in my bed looking up at her balcony. For days after I spent many hours cooking up plans to get up there. Should I throw a tennis ball up and go and find it, perhaps? No, there was only one thing for it. I'd just have to brave the big, cold stairs leading up to her door and knock. So I did. Her mum opened the door, looking dark and severe. Yes? So what do you want? I'd like to play with Sonia and Frankie, please. His name is Francois, she corrected me. Oh, sorry, but I've seen them both up here and just wanted to be their friend. A good 10 seconds passed, during which time I was convinced I might just be grabbed and thrown over the balcony. She looked over her shoulder and saw her 2 children looking out nervously at me. Then she turned, gave a huge warm smile and stepping aside said, Francois? Sonia? Come out here, please. And so it began, that first great adventure in that funny little place called love. Sonia had fine dark blonde hair, parted in the middle and combed into 2 plaits. She was radiant and always looked tanned. On her teeth were fixed 2 rows of vicious-looking metal braces, which I never spoke about with her. One afternoon, while Mum was out shopping, Sonia came to our flat. She looked at the posters on the bedroom wall, smiled, and drawing the back of her pleated skirt beneath her, sat down on my Z-bed. I'd seen a lot of kissing at the Saturday morning picture show, and in a very grand, stiff movement, I leaned over and kissed her on the cheek with feeling, eyes shut. Before I could withdraw, she grabbed me with both hands around the neck and planted a big, full kiss right on my lips. It seemed to last forever and ended in a gasp from both of us. Within minutes we were laying outstretched on the bed, snogging away for all we were worth. No tongues touched, though. We were just enveloped in each other's arms. It was heaven. As she left for home, I stood and watched her from my window. She never looked back at me, but I knew she had a delightful smile on her face. It was the same as the one on mine. Her braces had left my gums sore and bleeding, but I didn't feel a thing. My insides were shaking and throbbing in a most peculiar fashion, and I knew either I had a sudden case of pneumonia or I was in love. During the year that followed, her plaits went, along with her braces, and she blossomed into a very beautiful young woman. I'll always treasure my first love, as it never got messy or too physical, and because soon after she moved away with her family to a maisonette in Victoria, it never ended. We never said goodbye, so it was never over. And it wasn't long before I got to leave De Walden too. St Marylebone Grammar School for Boys had been founded in 1792 by a bunch of local businessmen who wanted to help poor boys of the area get a start in life. By the time I arrived in 1965, it was still a place for bright working-class boys and had kept many of its old traditions in place. Besides passing the 11 plus, in order to get into St Marylebone I had to pass an interview with the headmaster too. On walking into his office he pushed a series of photographs at me, across his desk. Did I recognise any? Luckily I did. I'd been reading about William Wilberforce, the great anti-slavery politician, at home, and there he was in front of me. That answer was enough to get me a place. The head stood up in his gown and mortarboard and said, "Very well done, Stuart." The education at St Marylebone was archaic, with Latin and Greek force-fed by a terrifying master, Mr Barker. He had a full head of white cropped hair, bad teeth, and was rumoured to have been a commando during World War II. He carried a large knife, which he would throw into his table while reciting verbs or used to clean his nails. After a short time in his classes, I made no attempt to understand Latin, copying homework from my new best friend, Dave Pash, instead. In return, I would protect Dave as much as I could from other boys who thought he was an easy option to push about. The school seemed to be populated by mildly eccentric teachers. The history master, Mr Hookway for instance, would climb around the classroom using the rafters like some crazed mountaineer as he taught. I enjoyed history anyway, but he made it more entertaining. There was no football at St Marylebone, and instead we played rugby. I had foolishly picked up a rugby ball early in my first year and scored a try, thus impressing the sportsmaster and earning myself countless bruises as I played every Saturday morning for the school team. There was also cricket, thankfully, and I became house captain. That most of the boys at St Marylebone were from better-off families didn't bother me. It was a plus in many ways. I made pals with one named Andrew Garara, who was the son of a sculptress, Mary Garara. She wore black roll-neck jumpers, faded jeans and sandals around the house, and had lovely brown eyes which I thought looked right into me. Mary Garara really introduced me to the world of art. She'd give me huge lumps of wet clay to do with what I pleased, and my efforts, though no doubt awful, seemed to impress her. I'd often take home ugly lopsided bowls or mugs, all painted and fired in the oven in her house in Hampstead. Andrew didn't get to visit my home, though. For the first year at St Marylebone Grammar I wouldn't invite anybody back to the Warden. It was easier not to have to explain. However, one memorable summer afternoon, the Right Honourable Quinton Hogg MP cycled into the De Walden courtyard on his trendy small-wheeled bicycle. He removed his bicycle clips and brushed down the lapels of his well-worn camel hair coat. Photographers from local and national newspapers were there to capture an historic moment. In a deep, resonant voice he announced, "I'm here to inspect the living conditions of my constituents here at, De Lungden Buildings." No one corrected him, as the power of the man was quite overwhelming. When he came into our very humble abode at number 4, he seemed like a giant. I was kneeling down at the white table by Mum's bed doing my homework. Quintin stood above me, clearly horrified by this state of affairs, and further alarmed by the poor quality of light allowed by the bedside lamp with its handmade frilly lampshade. "What school do you go to, my lad?" he asked, in an Eton accent. "St Marylebone Grammar, sir." "And is this the only place for you to study in?" "Afraid so, sir." "Well, my lad, I happen to be on the Board of Governors at St Marylebone, and this will just not do at all." He took out a pencil and pad and scribbled a few notes down. After a few more poses for the Marylebone Mercury, he was gone. Either by coincidence or perhaps it was just that our time was up, a letter arrived from the council soon after, offering us a 2-bedroom flat on a recently built housing estate not far away. It may have been a faceless old council flat to most people, but to Mum and me it was an orange-bricked palace. There were so many rooms, or so it seemed, that we couldn't decide which one to look at first when we got the keys, or which ones would be the bedroom or dining room. We both burst out laughing and hugged each other, crying for joy. That night, at the age of 12, I slept in my own room for the first time in my life. Not long after we moved, Mum got a new and oddly glamorous job as a daily for Paul McCartney. After school, I'd walk down to his huge white Georgian house in Cavendish Avenue, past the handful of tired, sullen girl fans outside, waiting, waiting as they always did. How they must have envied me as I pressed the doorbell, looked up into the security camera, and stepped through into the square paved courtyard beyond. At the time, the Beatles were working on songs that would be released on Revolver and then Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Since they always recorded at Abbey Road Studios just around the corner, Paul was often at home, usually with someone that Mum described as a beautiful girlfriend with red hair, which can only have meant the actress Jane Asher. Mum's tasks were simple enough, being mainly ironing or cleaning up around the house. Occasionally, I would be allowed to take Paul's huge sheepdog Martha for a walk around the block, giving me some sense of usefulness as well as bags of envy from the fans. Those fans would have been overcome had they known that Paul had given me, via my mum, an advanced pressing of the Revolver album, together with a note that read, "To Stuart, best wishes, Paul McCartney, Beatles." It was pinned on my bedroom wall next to the Chelsea and Manchester United posters until I moved out 6 years later. Amazingly, I was allowed to walk around the upper floors of the 18th century house, which was done out in perfect pop art style. There was a huge black room on the top floor, with no furniture, just a huge pile of his gold and silver discs and assorted memorabilia, which had somehow escaped being given to the fan club for distribution. Also there, still in its box, was his MBE, that, unlike John, he had not sent back to the palace. Paul was always friendly to my mother. In all the time she worked there, though, I only ever saw him once, and that was through a crack in the door. He came down the stairs and asked my mum, "Betty, will my shirt be ready soon?" I stood transfixed. There was a Beatle, with his long ebony hair and Sgt. Pepper moustache. I was surprised how tall he was, and the 9 o'clock shadow on his chin. Not long after we moved into our new home, my mum started to see a man named Tony. A little bit older than my mum, he was almost the exact opposite to Les, being sober, kind and generous. Maybe the experience of having been in the first wave of Allied soldiers to have liberated Auschwitz had a humbling effect on him, but it's just as likely that he'd been born that way. I quickly came to love him as a father. He married my mum when I was 16 and I was best man. By my third year at St Marylebone Grammar, the skinhead craze had begun. It was an entirely macho movement, with violence and racism at its core at worst, but with a brutal stylish flashiness at best. It was the logical progression in British working-class street style following on from the Mods, who had been the younger brothers of the Teds of the 1950s. For a year or so, I lived a double life. At home on the estate I was a football-loving, potentially loutish mini-skinhead, but at school I was a rugby-playing grammar school twat. Memories of being an apprentice skinhead mainly consist of hanging around, acting hard. Eventually I became bored with all the posturing and let my hair grow and grow and grow. By the time I was 17, I had hair down to my waist. In order to be able to afford the clothes and records that I so loved, I had 2 jobs as a teenager. The first was working as a groundsman in the Regent's Park Golf and Tennis School. At 6 a.m. I'd be there, levelling the clay courts, watering, sanding and finally pushing a huge cast iron roller up and down in neat rows. On Saturdays I worked in Courtney Chemists in St John's Wood High Street. With money I managed to save, I bought a Sunburst Fender Precision bass guitar and started a band with Dave Pash, who taught me to play, and Paul, a guitarist. We played mainly Cream and Hendrix songs which I'd sing and play bass to at the same time. Being at an all-boys school is a dreadful experience. Girls didn't seem to exist, and it wasn't until I was 18 that my then-girlfriend, Vicky, asked me why we hadn't done it yet. We'd just been to visit my dear Uncle Charlie and Aunt Mary at their beautiful cottage in Cookham, which is how we came to be sitting at Cookham Station when Vicky asked me if I didn't think it was a good idea to go all the way. You bet I did. The first time was not that good, as we had to use condoms and it was over all too quickly, but we didn't give up and we got better with each try. At the time I lost my virginity, I was studying for 3 A-levels, art, history and English. I was the only A-level art student at St Marylebone at the time and studying under the wonderful master there, Artie. Despite the headmaster trying to dissuade me from taking art A-level, Artie had truly supported me in my desire to do the exam, going as far as to organise a trip to the Tate to see the Andy Warhol exhibition for me, despite his personal disdain for Warhol. The show was a real eye-opener and included a lot of the now classic material, including the Elvis Gunslinger, Marilyn and screen-printed Elizabeth Taylors. It had a big impact on my own artwork at the time and must have done some good because I passed my Art A-level and applied to and was accepted by the notorious Hornsey College of Art. In 1968, Hornsey became one of the first places in England where a student sit-in brought the place to a standstill. There was some discussion about stopping the war in Vietnam at the time, but mostly it was all about revolution for revolution's sake. Hornsey College didn't look at all revolutionary to me though, when I turned up in September 1972. Most of the students looked as if it was still 1968, with their long, lank hair, flared jeans and sloppy sweaters. But as I walked around the campus, I spotted a very splendid-looking bloke with serious, well-groomed Apache-style hair to his waist, dressed all in black, and, like me, wearing some black brothel creepers. We nodded a sense of approval at each other. A few days later, I discovered that he was Danny Kleinman, the leader of Bazooka Joe, a well-known rock and roll revival band. He was soon to become my best friend. During my foundation year, I decided that I would do graphic design, typography and photography. I moved into a large, sunny room in Southgate, and since I had no reason to get up early, I would stay up as late as I could, sometimes going out to gigs with Danny and watching Bazooka Joe perform. After a while, I stopped watching them and started playing gigs as bassist and singer with them instead. For the first year at Hornsey, I worked hard and began to feel as if my life was changing. And then I spotted Carol. She was the cutest little blonde, wearing satin hot pants, suede knee-length boots, and had truly great legs. I was in love. Just like with Sonia back at De Walden Buildings, my heart skipped a beat when I saw her, and I could spend forever just kissing her, laying with her, being with her. Unlike with Sonia, though, there was also the sex. Sex was a dirty word in the Britain of the 1970s. There was a huge market for pornography, and double entendres were the stock of most television comedians. Public talk of sex either made it into a joke or something dangerous. I didn't get it. To me, sex was the greatest experience possible. Desire felt pure, not dirty, furtive, funny or wrong, and so I began to think of the act between Carol and I as pure sex. That was enough. I was a romantic and wanted Carol for myself only and forever, and so I asked her to marry me. She said yes. My mum and my stepdad Tony heartily approved, and her parents agreed that we should live with them in Muswell Hill. At a white wedding in St John's Wood in 1975, we exchanged rings. I've often asked myself why we married, and struggled to come up with a sensible answer. Neither of us was ready for marriage, but everyone seemed supportive of the idea. For a few brief months, with me feeling high and full of energy, we had a great time together. But then, things started to change. I began to feel the pressure of living with my in-laws, felt enormous pangs of jealousy if Carol as much as spoke to other guys, and couldn't manage to work at college and make music, which I was increasingly driven to do. Then one night in November 1975, I saw the Sex Pistols play their first gig. They were the support act to Bazooka Joe at St Martin's College of Art. It wasn't obvious at first, there was no blinding flash of realisation, but at the Pistols' first gig, Adam Ant became something real. When they kicked off, it was clear that Johnny Rotten was not your usual frontman. He didn't try to entertain or really even sing. He stood back from the microphone with his hands in his dirty, oversized trousers and spat out his version of the lyrics to the Small Faces' What You Gonna Do About It. He changed the words, of course, to I want you to know that I hate you, baby. I want you to know I don't care. The Pistols were loud and raw, but they could play, and the energy they generated was hair-raising. That the long-haired, polite students didn't get it made the Pistols' performance all the more exciting and confusing to me. We played our usual set, but it didn't feel right. The anger and the don't-give-a-shit attitude that the Pistols had shown made our rock and roll pastiche sound as second-hand as it was. I was annoyed and frustrated and didn't know what to do about it. A few days after the Pistols gig, I called Danny and told him that I wanted to leave Bazooka Joe and start my own band. I wanted to do something different, be someone else, but couldn't work out what and who. I named my new band the B-Sides because we only played the B-sides of 1960s singles. Leicester Square was my first co-band member. He joined when I told him that we were going to be a losers band, which is also what we told bassist Andy Warren when he joined after answering an ad in Melody Maker. We called ourselves losers because we didn't want to be what were considered music winners back then. Plastic pop stars like ELO or self-indulgent prog rockers like Pink Floyd. If that was what being winners meant, then we wanted to be the opposite. As we rehearsed through Christmas 1975 and into the early part of 1976, I could feel Adam growing stronger. I could hear the music that I wanted to make forming in my mind. But I felt that it was being stunted by the B-sides. So I took a break from them while I worked on my own songs, some of which would later become Ant songs, including Fat Fun, B-Side Baby and Puerto Rican. It was around then that I decided college had to go. I'd told Peter Webb, the head of my course, and said that I'd always be grateful to him for introducing me to the work of Alan Jones and his S&M art. A lot of what I'd learned at Hornsey would become a part of Adam Ant's stage show. But while I was trying to get Jones's imagery and my own dark thoughts into the form of songs, I was barely sleeping and eating only occasionally. Inevitably, perhaps, as the long, hot summer of 1976 began, I started to suffer hallucinations and depressions as bad as they'd ever been when I was a kid. I couldn't create music because I had no energy. I was in a right state when, that night, I knew that I couldn't be Stuart Goddard anymore, and so took the pills, which is where we began. Carol's dad had driven both of us back from Free and Barnet Hospital without saying a word. Carol cried quietly as I lay my head on her shoulder and stared, unblinking, at the neon lights passing overhead through the windscreen. Back in our room in Muswell Hill, Carol tried to get me to explain why I'd done it. She was scared, of course, and I think possibly a bit relieved when I said that I had to leave her. Because it felt like the end of my old life, I explained that I had to live somewhere else and make a new start. I could have gone to Mum's place, but I didn't. It was going to be impossible to tell her that I killed her only son, Stuart Goddard. Instead, I went to see my father and his second wife, Doreen. I knew she would get it and not tell me to stop being so stupid. By the time Doreen answered the door, my mind felt clearer than it had for months. "Stuart, bloody hell, love, you look terrible. Have you been ill?" "It's all right, Doreen, I'm fine, but don't call me Stuart anymore. I'm Adam, okay?" "Oh, love, you can be whoever you want to be. Come in and tell me all about it." Doreen and Les lived in the porter's flat of the block that he was supposed to look after in Westminster. Doreen, a victim of severe depression and manic fits, was completely accepting of Adam and defended me against my old man's occasional moans about who the bloody hell I thought I was. I stayed with them for a few weeks before finding my own place, a single room in a shared house in Earl's Court. Having decided that I wanted to be Adam and concentrate on making music, I set about getting to know one of the most incredible-looking women I'd ever seen. She worked in a shop called Sex in the King's Road run by Malcolm McLaren, and her name was Jordan. She'd been at the St Martin's gig with her hair in a pointed beehive and Bowie-type black zigzag across her face. I was so impressed by her that I started writing to her. She never replied, of course, so soon after moving into Doreen and Les's place, I started to visit Sex regularly. The shop used to be called Too Fast to Live, Too Young to Die when it sold Ted and rocker gear, but McLaren renamed it and started to sell vibrators, rubber suits and S&M gear. McLaren's partner, Vivian Westwood, also created Ted trousers in pink and mohair jumpers in bright colours. I kept going there partly to look at the clothes, but mostly to work up the nerve to talk to Jordan, who could kill you with a look. Finally, one day I picked up a Destroy t-shirt and approached the counter. Probably unnerved by the look she was getting from me, Jordan slipped into the back with another assistant, Sue Catwoman. I could hear them giggling together as I stood waiting to pay. As Simon, the only male assistant in the shop, took my money, he asked if I lived in Muswell Hill. I stammered that I used to, and Jordan and Sue strangled a scream. The postmark on the letters I'd sent, which I later turned into the song Jordan Send a Letter To, had given me away. I decided to front it out and ask Jordan if she would ever come and see my band play. She didn't say no, just that she'd have to see. I left Sex that afternoon happy and determined that my band would play live as soon as possible. Because of a lack of money, and because Carol, who had decided to change her name to Eve to show the world that she was my wife, wanted to see me, Lester, Andy and I rehearsed at her parents' house. We were no longer the B-sides and had begun playing songs that I was writing. This was the Ants. I'd chosen the name because it went with Adam very well and because ants were hard-working, tough and communal. The music was raw and loud. Making music was occupying me full-time that summer of punk. My hallucinations had stopped and my depression had gone. I felt as if I could do anything that I wanted. End of CD 1.